Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation podcast, a place to learn about new ideas from thought leaders in the area of optimal health, the science of mind-gut microbiome interactions, food, and the environment. Today, I have the great pleasure to speak to Dr. Robert Lufkin, author of the recent book, Lies I Taught in Medical School: How Conventional Medicine is Making You Sicker and What You Can Do to Save Your Life. Despite its provocative title, the book goes into lay-friendly detail over the main diseases which make up today's chronic non-contagious disease epidemic and points out the failures of conventional medicine to deal with the root causes underlying this epidemic and provide more effective treatment approaches. Dr. Lufkin has been an academic radiologist who has taught at UCLA and USC, and is the author of more than 200 scientific papers and 14 books. Welcome to the show, Robert. Okay, Rob, it's a pleasure having the opportunity to talk to you today. You've come out with an amazing book, Lies I Taught in Medical School, and we'll come to the title later. I maybe have some little bit different view on this, but it's definitely a very, a title that receives a lot of attention. So let me start off with something simple. As a successful academic radiology and medical imaging expert, how did you end up writing a book about the pathophysiology and therapy of chronic diseases, which is really, in some ways, not part of your training and well-known expertise. So if you could just elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, and thanks. Before we start, thank you, Emran, I'm a huge fan of yours and your books. I've learned so much from you and this podcast as well. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here today. But yeah, my background is in medical imaging. I've spent essentially my entire career in academics as a professor teaching, but also seeing patients, but it was in medical imaging. So I do represent kind of the medical establishment a little bit. What forced me to rethink my position about things, and actually was the driving force for writing this book, was like many people, I came down with chronic diseases, and I was diagnosed with 4 chronic diseases. And like a good patient, I went to my doctor and I was prescribed prescription medicines. And I asked about lifestyle, and I was told, it doesn't really work, and you're going to be on these prescriptions for the rest of your life, so get used to it. And I knew enough about chronic disease that these diseases, I had young children at the time in elementary school, and I knew it wasn't going to end well. So almost out of self-interest, I began, looking to see if there was any other way. And I came across this large body of research that's continually growing that I wasn't aware of, that many of my colleagues are still not aware of, about that changed my thinking about these chronic diseases and allowed me to do some changes with my own lifestyle, that I was able to reverse these diseases. And I wanted to get this message out to the general population, and hopefully help some people so that they don't make the same mistakes that I had made.
Yes, that's always, coming from being affected yourself to a new insight. It's not an uncommon path, actually, so. And I've done similar kinds of things, in my own career. It didn't really surprise me to hear this from you, and in your preface and in the book. So let me get to the book. So it's an excellent, outstanding review of diseases of this unfolding epidemic of chronic non-contagious diseases, as it's been called, with critical assessment of the failures of conventional medicine to significantly change its course. As discussed in my own books, I largely agree with this assessment. And also, the one thing that I've realized, it's something really hidden in the behind the screen, is the huge role of the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex, and if you go further, the food agricultural industrial complex. So I've come to the conclusion, well, doctors are trained based on evidence usually takes about 10 years before that latest evidence actually makes it into the curriculum. It's a very conservative system, just like the NIH is very conservative of sort of funding studies that you already have done 90%. And so why blame conventional medicine as the primary culprit of this problem? So you've all the huge, entities that.
Yeah, and let me say this about conventional medicine, sort of Western medicine, if you will. I'm a product. We're both involved in Western medicine, so we're part of it. But I still believe that this is not an indictment of all Western medicine. This book, rather, I believe that Western medicine is unequaled in the benefits that it has given mankind in the 20th century with public health, infectious diseases, and really made our lives a lot better. And even today, if I walk out in the street and I get hit by a bus, I will want a blood transfusion. I'll want a splenectomy. I'll want, I'll want acute Western interventions that will save my life. And lifestyle may play a role, and maybe I'll heal better and get better faster, but acutely I'll want those. So it's not that Western medicine isn't good and doesn't offer things. The problem, in my opinion, is that in the 21st century, today, 80% of diseases we faced and the expenses of Western medicine is not spent on the types of things I was talking about that they're so good at, but instead it's talked about a growing cause of disease, so-called chronic diseases that Western medicine has applied the same pills and surgery that they've applied to the other things that were so effective. But the problem is, in my opinion, the pills and surgeries don't really work for these chronic diseases. They may mask the symptoms. They may even be life-saving in the case of insulin for an acute sugar or glucose reaction. But long-term, they actually, in most cases, do very little to improve the underlying chronic disease, and the disease continues on. And I think that lifestyle is the way to approach it. But your question was about the Western medical system, and the Western medical system is influenced, as you alluded to, by numerous things, by pharmaceutical companies, and even our medical institutions, our trusted medical societies, like the American Heart Association was funded by largely initially by Procter & Gamble, which makes an inflammatory seed oil called Crisco, and many others, to the point that the American Heart Association still recommends seed oils, which I believe are pro-inflammatory. They recommend them as a heart healthy option to saturated fats, which I disagree with and I think is bad. But the American Diabetic Association, look at their sponsor list on their website. One of their biggest sponsors is DaVita. DaVita is a dialysis company, renal dialysis. Of course, the number one cause of renal failure is diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And now we see on this website recommendations for high sugar recipes that the patients are counseled to cover with insulin, which I believe is the wrong advice and harmful advice, and will lead to more people needing DaVita. So the medical system is influenced by these things. The food pyramid, which was created for a recommended healthy diet for a couple of decades. Nina Teicholz and others have recently published papers showing the links with large food, big food industries in the framers of the food pyramid. And if you look at the food pyramid, which is the recommendations of what people should eat to be healthy, the bottom row is what people should eat most of. And if you look at the bottom row, it's all basically junk food. It's high carbohydrate grains, things which typically make up the junk foods that the people who wrote the food pyramid would benefit from. So I think the influences are all out there.
Yeah, and it's I mean, sometimes, you know, you feel it's kind of a losing battle because I mean the billions in um, money that goes into lobbying, and I mean just the fact that, you know, the the election cycle starts in Iowa because everybody wants to satisfy the farmers that grow corn, you know, which is the main source for sugar in our diet, the high fructose corn syrup. Um, so there's so many of these entrenched forces that sometimes you think, yeah, we can go to the public, write books, and this is going to reach a sort of small section, a small slice of the population. It's not going to affect the people in the middle of the country. You know, it's going to affect a few people on the east and west coasts, but maybe younger people now. But it's not going to solve the crisis because of this massive, um, you know, these massive interests that are behind it and that nobody really sees or talks about. You know, I think that's. Let me say something about this. So I imagine like what you did to get over your own chronic diseases were a lot of lifestyle modifications. Can you elaborate on this? Well,
Yeah. And just one quick thing. I mean, there is hope that people like Nina Teicholz, who has been very active in the nutrition space, and she has formed a group called the Nutrition Coalition that I'm part of. It's a nonprofit, but one of the things we're doing is approaching the FDA, I'm sorry, the USDA, who made the food pyramid, to make the next food pyramid have one specifically for people with metabolic disease, because the food pyramid supposedly is for healthy Americans. But as we know, you know, by many studies, most Americans actually are not healthy. They have metabolic disease. So there's some hope there that through various channels, but I couldn't agree with you more. It's definitely an uphill battle, and simply writing a book is not necessarily going to do it, but hopefully more and more people thinking this way, and eventually over time, hopefully this will change. Yeah.
I mean, the thing that also complicated, you know, has complicated is that it's been politicized. I mean, there's almost a divide in the country that, you know, anything the government would come up with new guidelines or, you know, healthy food or growing your own food is considered for half of the American population you know, an anathema. They don't want to go there because they think it's all the woke, you know, uh, uh, propaganda, and that's another really serious thing that, you know, this should not be politicized. I mean, there should be a general agreement of everybody that this is a huge problem, and you know we need to tackle it together. You can't.
Yeah. I mean, even with diets, I was surprised to find that there's a very a politicized feeling with the vegan diet, which is, you know, all vegetable, all plant, and a carnivore diet. They're almost politically
Yeah,
opposed,
yeah, yeah.
and there's an animosity not unlike between Republicans and Democrats over the food. And I have to say, first of all, I love my vegan friends. I love my carnivore friends. I think you can be very healthy or unhealthy on either one of those diets, and it's not necessarily that. I think it's the choices we make within those. But it's fascinating with the politics have gotten worse. I think everyone would acknowledge in the last 20 years, mental health has gotten worse. And one of the realizations in this book is I can't help but wondering, we now know that metabolic health and, you know, junk food diets and other, you know, effects on metabolic health and the gut microbiome can actually affect mental illness, with the work of Chris Palmer and Georgia Ede and others. It makes you wonder if um, that, fine, you know, you and I don't have frank mental illness, but you wonder how much our environments, our lifestyle is affecting us mentally, not to the point where we have full-blown psychosis, but we all have ups and downs in our lives, dealing with our spouses, our kids, our employers, our employees, and everything. And that seems to be fraught with more tension, you know, more politicization than there was 20 years ago. And I can't help but wondering how much this dysbiosis or this metabolic abnormality could be contributing to that.
Yeah, and it's a vicious cycle. I mean, the more you know upset you are, and the more anxious and the more depressed, not full-blown depression, but if you look into the future, I think it's never looked as so many dark clouds, certainly not in my lifetime, as it is right now. So that affects the eating behavior. And unfortunately, unhealthy food is a very effective short-term treatment, for lifting your emotions. It's short-term, gives you pleasure, make you feel good for a short period of time, but then you go deeper and deeper down this cycle. And I mean, we don't know exactly, what the mechanisms are. I mean, clearly with the microbiome, you have all these neuroactive metabolites. I personally believe that the inflammatory component of the microbiome is the more important one. I think that these, neurotransmitters that microbes can make, I mean, they may play some role in anxiety and possibly depression, but I think the inflammatory influence is probably the more important one. And yeah, so yeah, just come back to my question. What did you do to get over your own problems?
Oh, well, for me, it was, let me say, I was raised with a dietitian. My mom was a professional dietitian. So we followed the food pyramid religiously. We had what we thought at the time was a healthy diet. So I was raised on low fat. We got rid of butter because of the saturated fats, and we replaced it with what we thought was healthy trans fats and seed oils and margarine, and it goes on and on and on. So what I did, the changes I made in my life, I changed my nutrition, my sleep, it went through everything. The nutrition was probably the biggest one. I slowed down when I ate. So instead of eating many small meals a day like my mom had taught me and snacking all the time, I stopped eating after dinner and then stopped between meal snacks. And without changing what I ate, I think it's possible just by changing when one eats, by giving the gut a rest. In other words, food itself is inflammatory, no matter what kind of food it is, just by its nature, foreign material in the gut. So not having food in the gut 24 hours a day, or at least giving it a little pause there, I think is beneficial. So that's the first thing I did, was begin fasting or having breaks from eating. Now I eventually stop breakfast and I stop lunch most days. And now I just have dinner when my kids get home from school, and have one meal a day. And I've never felt better that way. But I also looked at what I ate, and I did 3 changes to the composition of the food I ate. And the first thing I did was I eliminated carbohydrates and sugars, starches, refined carbohydrates as much as possible. Those drive insulin, they drive inflammation, they drive mTOR, all sorts of negative effects there. And the second thing I did was remove seed oils for the reasons we talked about, pro-inflammatory as much as possible. Those are harder to get rid of because it's not like they have a taste or anything, and they're in practically everything. Even when I go to a restaurant and I specifically ask them if I want olive oil, on my salad, they say, "Oh, this is pure olive oil." And I say, "Can you bring the bottle out?" And they bring the bottle out, and of course it's labeled olive oil, but the ingredients are 70% vegetable oil, 10%, 20%, 30% olive oil. Same thing with butter in restaurants. A lot of substitution or enhancement with seed oils. But then the last thing I do is grains. I love baked goods. Nothing better than a bagel and all that. But there's one thing I love more than baked goods, and that's my children. And so I don't have celiac disease. I'm not allergic to gluten, but I believe that many adults, as you've talked about, have a low-grade inflammation due to the proteins in the grains and the glyphosates, the weed killer, of course, too.
I was going to mention something about carbohydrates. I mean, clearly complex carbohydrates, which translates into high fiber content, are sort of really the food that our microbes love the most. I mean, that's basically what provides them with raw material to generate anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acids. And unfortunately, when we talk about carbohydrates and all the products that are available in the supermarket, the fiber has been taken out. So it's the rice without the fiber. It's the it's the bread without the fiber. Maybe somebody added something to it to make up for this, but essentially, there are definitely good carbohydrates, essential complex carbohydrates. And I think it's often thrown together, when people talk about carbohydrates, and it's misunderstood that like if you eat a diet high in vegetables, there's a lot of complex carbohydrates that you eat that
Yeah.
make
Absolutely. I
so
totally agree with that. Yeah, it's more refined carbohydrates, and that, is the starches, and for me, the starches and the sugars. And I want to say everyone is different too. I'm reporting what worked for me with an N of 1, and also literature that it worked for other people. But I think we all have to, look at ourselves and examine what works for us.
I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Lustig from UCSF, who's a big crusader against sugar in the diet. And do you think sugar alone would be the main culprit really in the diet? If you had to eliminate one thing, I have to change one thing, would it be the sugar content, both hidden and added sugar?
Well, sugar has a big effect on hemoglobin A1C, which is the biochemical test that most people use for diabetes and prediabetes, which almost half of adults have now. So I think sugar is probably the biggest player in there, not only driving insulin resistance, but also driving inflammation. But people have pointed out that the sugar consumption, while it's high, it hasn't really taken off in the last 30 years, which all these chronic diseases have taken off. So it brings into question other things like, gut dysbiosis or seed oils possibly, which have taken off, or other junk food substitutions. The high fructose corn syrup in the 1980s basically started non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which didn't exist before that and is now the #1 liver disease and cause of liver transplants. So sugar is certainly, it's something, it's simple to start with. The seed oils are more challenging, and the grains are even more challenging, I found in my experience.
So you go through 10 chronic diseases, 10 chapters in your book, sort of the major components of this chronic disease epidemic. If you had to pick one, where you would sort of elaborate, I mean, each of them you bring like really amazing, commentary and critique and what's being done and what should be done. Which one would stands out the most for you?
Well, half of Americans are overweight or obese, but I'm not going to pick that one. I'm going to pick type 2 diabetes, because type 2 diabetes, I think, is the model disease for insulin resistance and inflammation. And I think it's at the root of metabolic dyshealth, and the same factors that drive type 2 diabetes drive all the other chronic diseases that are in the book. And my thinking about type 2 diabetes changed a little bit. As a physician, I was trained to think of patients, you either have the disease or you don't have the disease. And that's necessary for the system to work. But what I realized is that type 2 diabetes, there's a large study that came out of non-diabetic Americans from the Framingham data and NHANES data. And they looked at this marker for type 2 diabetes, the hemoglobin A1C. And when it passes a certain mark, you're type 2 diabetic. And when it's below that number, you're not. And what this study showed was that with aging, along with inflammation and other things, the hemoglobin A1C actually increases. Like the older you get, the higher your A1C is going to be. So what that made me think is that type 2 diabetes isn't necessarily something that, a few people get. Well, maybe half the people get now and the other half don't. Instead, I think of it more like gray hair with aging. In other words, if I don't die of something else first, I will definitely get this. And so how does that inform my thinking? Well, it makes me think now I want to choose a lifestyle that is going to be beneficial to avoiding type 2 diabetes and metabolic health. And I've come to think that way about all the chronic diseases. In other words, Alzheimer's doesn't start when the doctor says you can't remember your keys, you have Alzheimer's. Same thing, the heart attack doesn't start when I get chest pain, and cancer doesn't start when, you know, there's a nodule on my lung. I believe that all these chronic diseases start years to decades before the doctor diagnoses them. And if we wait until the doctor diagnoses them, there's a missed opportunity for prevention, and we're at a disadvantage as far as treating them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. I mean, I've always been amazed about, you know, the time course, like, for example, of Parkinson's disease, where, you know, I've seen patients that came to my clinic with new onset constipation in their 40s, and I did notice, I actually write this in my book, I've seen a couple of times that they had this very slight tremor, this characteristic Parkinson's tremor in their hand, and neither the patient nor his wife at this point actually had paid attention to it. They just thought it was a very, so, you know, I sent this patient to neurology for evaluation of early Parkinson's, and that was positive, you know, and what they realized, that lived in an area of the Central Valley, you know, epidemic for or endemic for Parkinson's disease. And they were always told me these stories how these dust croppers flew over their property and sprayed glyphosate on you know, on the crops. And so they moved away and, you know, totally switched their diet and their lifestyle. And unfortunately, I haven't seen them since then. But there's good evidence now. You may have 15 years from the onset of the constipation or some sleep abnormality, 15 years before the first neurological symptoms of Parkinson's become apparent. And I would say probably 95% of patients come at that point, you know, when they actually have clinical symptoms of. So huge opportunity, obviously, for earlier interventions and lifestyle interventions. You know, we didn't really have a great medication that would slow this process, but lifestyle, as this family did, you know, with their kids. I mean, they all had problems. They all had health problems. You know, it's kind of a shame that this still is allowed to happen. You know, that spraying of chemicals on the population. But anyway, so yeah, so in your book, you emphasize, we've talked a little bit about this now, the supreme importance of dietary recommendations and dietary factors. But there's obviously a large number of other things going on now in our environment, accelerating, I would say. So you talked about these last 30 years, but things have really accelerated, I would say, since end of World War II, slowly first, but and there's all these other things. The latest, I would say, is these micro and nano plastics that have been detected everywhere in the water, but now also in the body, and has been shown to be correlated with increased risk for atherosclerotic disease. And have even been detected. Somebody told me this last week in the testes. I don't know how that was determined from a biopsy or whatever. So we have no idea what this does. I mean, this is another one of those intriguing questions. You know, you would think if whatever we drink and consume and eat now is full with these particles, and there's nothing on the horizon that this would actually slow. You know, even if you buy healthy food, fruits and vegetables, always in the plastic cover, in these plastic boxes. So we don't really know. I mean, this could be as important or maybe even more important than, you know, than the diet. This is the thing where we're really, in some ways, in the dark. And then I think there's always two possibilities. Either it's the interaction of all these things, the diet with, or one component is really the major one. I believe it's the interaction. If you think about, you know, the lack of fiber in our diet leading to insufficient production of short-chain fatty acids, that's definitely a risk factor for inflammation. So you add some other components to this, you know, that stimulate inflammation, then you have the perfect storm. So, I mean, I mean, what do you think about these many other factors that we are exposed to in modern life?
Absolutely, it's such an important point you make. In a chapter about obesity, we talk about obesogens. In other words, for obesity, and I would argue for these other chronic diseases, a dietary modification for metabolic health may help the diet and the gut, but even tuning that to an optimal state, if there's something else going on, like a toxin like lead or mercury or Lyme disease or mold, uh, or maybe microplastics, we just don't know, but it's certainly disturbing to find them. We have to look at all aspects of our lives. If our sleep is disordered, you know, taking college students, that famous study, and basically withholding sleep from them, and they all became diabetic. They're basically, their insulin resistance went up, and uh, so all all sorts of things, exercise, stress, even our mental state and our mindset can overwhelm the effects of nutrition. So nutrition is good, but lifestyle encompasses much more than that, as you indicate. I would agree with that totally.
Yeah, and I would say so. I mean, by sort of differentiating from a gastroenterologist to sort of a much more general health concerned individual, I sort of became fascinated with this idea, like systems biology. This is a good example of systems biology. It's always multiple factors that interact in a network, and it's not one factor that drives, the abnormal behavior of that network. It's always the combination. You get to a tipping point, when too many of these factors coincide. I mean, there's a lot of people, with very unhealthy lifestyle. I think, I mean, Trump is a good example, just living on fast food. I think Henry Kissinger was an example like that. And then they live into the hundreds, I mean, it's so their system is resilient because they may not have all these factors that contribute to it. And there is this phenomenon that I still haven't gotten a good answer for. In several countries in the world, there's now this rapid rise of centenarians, of people who live into the hundreds. And it's not because they have changed their lifestyle. It's in Japan, it's in China, it's in Italy. So none of these countries have really changed. They've certainly not done the things that you're promoting and
Mhm.
getting. Why is that? Is this there's some other factor going on that we don't know? Protective.
Yeah, I mean, I love Dan Buettner's Blue Zones project, and I agree with, philosophically, things about family and community and all that. That those studies have come under criticism with some of the centenarians in that particular study, because um, they noticed that the birth rates of the centenarians were non-random, whereas the general population has a random birth rate. So non-random birth rate indicates that people may be picking a birthday or something. But
Mhm.
but that being aside, I think the ideas are good for the blue zones. I'm also concerned that the brand, the Blue Zones, was recently sold to a religious organization. That I have nothing against religious organizations, but it has a particular nutritional agenda, and I'm sad to see that any particular agenda driving
Mm.
messaging like that. But yeah, to your point, I think people are living a lot longer, despite COVID and all the challenges we're going through. The average age used to be 60 for now. Women in Tokyo can expect to live to their late 80s, in Japan, and some of these places are really long. I think all of us need to re-examine our lives in view of a longer lifespan, because it may be that after age 65 we live another 40 years, perhaps. And it's we have to look at things differently. We have to look at medicine differently. We have to look at all kinds of things. And I mean, maybe that's a good thing that it is a good thing that we're living longer. I mean, nobody wants to die shorter, but given the collapsing fertility rates, when I was little, we were always frightened of the population explosion and the overpopulation, and that was a big concern. But now, who would have thought it's population collapse and fertility rates around the world are now reaching serious levels, and at least increasing longevity. It's not a solution, but at least it will offset that a little bit.
Yeah, these examples to me always emphasize, we actually know so little. I mean, like we pretend definitely in the medical sciences, and like you think you go to medical school and you know it all, because we know everything, the mechanisms. But in reality, I mean, these bigger trends, we still have no clue what actually goes on.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating realization, but I think whatever we talked about, falls into this category. We're just
And that was part of the sort of the lighthearted, or some would say clickbait style title of my book, lies I taught in medical school. Wait a minute, who teaches lies? But it's sort of, anyone who knows science and medicine knows that that's the nature of the beast. And I think I quote in it, Sir William Osler, one of the greatest physicians of all times, had one of the greatest quotes about healthcare education when he delivered to a class of graduating medical students who were about to become doctors, and they'd just gone through medical school. And he said, "Gentlemen," back then it was gentlemen, it was men at least, "I have a confession to make. 50% of what we've just taught you is probably wrong. The problem is we don't know which half."
so that's actually very good. Yeah, it's a very good point. Yes, sticking with this topic, that you mentioned with the title of your book. I mean, that initially, and it's definitely clickbait, a great way of attracting attention. It's sort of turned me off, and I think talking to you, it has clarified some of this. But having had a rewarding career as a scientist and teacher and clinician at UCLA, and published a large number of papers, I don't think I ever could catch myself, even now when I read the title of your book, I said, okay, how could that possibly apply to my own career? And I couldn't identify a single incident, a single paper where I would say this was a lie. I almost think like a lie has to be intentional. I mean, could you clarify this?
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, did you pick, or did your publisher pick that title because it's something that attracts a lot of attention,
Part of it was we wanted to write for a general audience and attract attention. I mean, like I've written, like 10 textbooks in the past in 6 languages, but they're medical textbooks. They're for doctors, they're for things, and nobody reads them, So I wanted to write something that would reach people, and it is aimed at everyday people. There are pictures and photographs. It's heavily illustrated. There's also references in it, but I wanted to aim at that audience. So part of it, I wanted a provocative title. But let me just say, I don't believe, I have a fundamental good faith belief in humanity. I don't think most people, including healthcare providers, get up in the morning and say, I want to harm someone. I want to do something that's going to do damage, or I want to tell lies, for that matter. But I think the system that we're in is full of pernicious, corrupting influences, some conscious, subconscious, some financial, some other ones, that distort the information that we have, and then the way we deliver it. Our system constrains us in a certain way also. So yeah, no direct lies. And I talk about that in the book. In the beginning, I sort of try to unravel that a little bit as well too. So yeah, I don't believe, people directly teach lies to deceive for the most part. But there are things that are untrue still being taught at leading medical schools and by otherwise, experts in the field, that this book disagrees with. And that is deeply disturbing.
I mean, part of that problem I've experienced, this in a somewhat different direction. So, like based on my research and my clinical experience, I've proposed and wrote articles about this brain-gut connection 45 years ago when I started at UCLA. This is basically why I wanted to be at UCLA, because there was somebody there at the time that was for me sort of a role model. And so it's taken 40 years. This has been denied and fought against by my colleagues and by the system. And so only about, I think it was 7 years ago, the official organizations in this field of, functional GI disorders came up with a novel insight that these are disorders of brain-gut interactions. I couldn't believe it. It took 40 years. And it wasn't easy. I mean, I'm not sure why I stayed in it, because I had a hard time getting grants initially. And every meeting I presented the data, people got up and said, Dr. Meyer, don't forget, these are gut disorders. This has nothing to do with the brain. And so medicine, I don't think anybody does anything intentionally negative. It's just such an incredibly conservative system that people want to stick with with simple concepts that they promote and that got a name recognition, and they will not deviate. They will not change that hypothesis. So this is definitely something I personally wouldn't blame medicine as much as the system of funding and the conservatism of the whole system. Also that it takes 10 years before a new insight gets into the textbooks, and medical students are being taught what was to believe 10 years ago. I think that's sort of, for me personally, the major problem in medicine, that it's just moves way too slow, considering not in all areas. I mean, there's areas, as you know, like cancer therapy, for example, immunotherapy has rapidly moved forward, including inclusion of the microbiome into it. This has happened within a couple of years, but other areas move extremely slow. In cardiology, for example, I mean, GI moves really fast in terms of procedures, but not necessarily in insights. So it's a heterogeneous field, with some specialties actually doing what everybody should be doing, and others sort of being that ultra conservative. I mean, stick
Yeah.
to the status quo.
And that slow adoption pace may have been acceptable 50 years ago when science didn't move as fast. But today, in the age of the internet and PubMed and online review, that's no longer acceptable. Things are changing so rapidly now. And,
Yeah.
we talk about, especially the longevity space, everything is just exploding, but all the areas in this book. And it's, we can't wait 10 years for medical education to catch up.
So another thing that I want to ask you, so and I'm kind of, in some ways, even though I've stepped out of the mainstream medicine myself in a lot of ways, and saying things that my colleagues in the division of gastroenterology at UCLA do not even talk about or know or accept. But this medicine bashing has become sort of a whole segment of the healthcare system, and it comes in different ways. I mean, it comes in the rapid rise of functional medicine, which I think is still okay I sort of like what functional medicine proposes based on the model that they have, the holistic model. I don't subscribe to many of the recommendations, which are not evidence-based. But what's worse is what goes on the internet, that a lot of self-appointed experts now, some of whom sadly actually come from the traditional medical, part of healthcare. And they are promoting stuff that, I mean, they're promoting it, but then you go to the website and behind, in the back, they have this whole pharmacy of supplements and unsubstantiated compounds that they promote. So yeah, to the outside, it seemed like, they're the future, they're against pharma, big pharma, but in reality, they're doing something even worse. At least pharma has to prove that something works. What they promote does not have to go through that, which is a big problem, I think, in our healthcare system. So, I mean, what do you think about that? That we now have this growing number of people that address the public. It's becoming more and more popular. amongst the public. I get a lot of, comments on social media. What do you think about this? And you forgot to mention this. And so what do you think about this trend that's happening now?
Well, I think I'm actually optimistic. I think we're in a new era as a patient. It's a new era where instead of patients just receive instructions and pills and surgery from their doctors, and then they go on and lead their lives. Instead, it's a new era where there are many different opinions coming in, and from trusted doctors, but also from internet doctors and other people as well. And now sort of the patient has agency. They have control over their lives. It means they have to pay attention when someone sends them to their website, just like the American Diabetes Association. You look and they're paid for it by DaVita, or Coca-Cola sponsors the American Dietetic Association. We all have to look at websites for products that we buy and see the sponsorship links. But I think it's really an empowering time, because like doctors, as we all know, doctors don't make people healthy. They just make people less sick. And if I want to be healthy, the patient has to do it myself as a patient. And I believe the way to do it is through lifestyle and the environment, identifying toxins, the gut, nutrition, all these things. But those things today largely are under control of me. And the healthcare system isn't really set up to provide training or instruction or even advice about this. And so I see it as a new era where patients are in charge of their health, and they get to, every day you wake up and you get to decide what your lifestyle is going to be that day, what you eat, when you eat, and other choices like that. So, but it takes involvement by the patient. It's different than just paternalistically going in, and he or she, the doctor, will hand you a pill and you go home and then go back to your normal life. It's actually engaging with your health. But I think that's possible, and I'm optimistic about it.
Maybe we are in a transition phase, where the new model, in my opinion, I mean, there's a few excellent examples of, that physicians provide really positive, valuable, actionable information that is evidence-based and that is not influenced by pharma or food companies. But there's also a lot of these other, which are very successful, a lot of these other promoters that I hope ultimately will go away with a better education of the public. I mean, this is definitely one of my goals, with the social media. Until I wrote my first book, I didn't even know what Instagram is or Facebook, and in the meantime, I've realized how powerful that can be if it's used responsibly, and hopefully, more and more healthcare providers will use this responsibly, not just to sell their supplements. That's sort of my hope that will happen. And
yeah. I think it's a great opportunity that, and things are moving in the direction. I mean, I wish, a few years ago when I was diagnosed with these things, the doctor would have said, here are these pills, but there's good evidence to show that, for your blood pressure, if you do this diet, you will get off the pills potentially. And for your prediabetes, you can, with diet, reverse it, but that wasn't communicated to me. And, I almost didn't dodge a bullet there.
Yeah, and we're in sort of so we have just a couple more minutes left, but I do want to squeeze in that question. So we have these new drugs, these GLP-1 and GIP agonists, which have been called miracle drugs because for the first time there's something that has a demonstrated in randomized controlled trials and lasting effects on not just obesity but also diabetes. And now more and more studies are coming out. I think just recently a study on kidney disease as a consequence of type 2 diabetes, and people talking about the animal experiments, the anti-inflammatory effects of these compounds that may not even work the way we thought they work. So a lot of people will say, so as long as, like Medicare and the insurance companies pay for it, why deal with all these complicated lifestyle modifications? I'm so busy in my life, I can't, I'm commuting 2 hours and I have 3 kids to raise and, take them to soccer games on the weekend. I don't have time to do all these things. So how do you see this rise of these new drugs, that are effective, maybe even more effective in the next few years when the new studies come out than we think right now? I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, like most people, I would much rather take a pill than change my diet, change my exercise, change my stress. I would give me a pill. And I think that's on the patients too. Patients demand a pill. They don't want lifestyle advice. The problem is, in my opinion, that just as you say, we really don't understand how mTOR works or how insulin works or how all these myriad metabolic factors interact. And when we use a pill, we're hitting one button on it, just like with rapamycin for mTOR. I never recommend rapamycin for longevity without doing lifestyle. And similarly, with the new obesity drugs, as you say, wow, they'll work forever. Well, you have to take them forever too, and
Yeah.
that's an issue. Um, and someone posted about nature's Ozempic, and they had a picture of a hard-boiled egg. And basically, if you eat one or two of those a day, your appetite's going to go down. Your hemoglobin A1C will go down because there's no refined carbs or sugar in it. And you'll probably be healthier. So, if the drugs prevents a surgery, which is irreversible, or prevents a worse treatment, I'm all for it because the drugs can still be stopped. It's harder to completely reverse a surgery. But ultimately, I think there are benefits of lifestyle and changing who we are that we don't even fully appreciate now, and that they're better than any single drug or any miracle drug, at least so far, including the new obesity ones that can do. And that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, so this is a great way to end this conversation. It was really fascinating. Thank you very much for taking the time. I have less of an issue now with accepting the book title.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad we got that squared away.
Okay, thanks again.
Well, thanks so much, Emran. It was a real pleasure. I hope we get you on my podcast soon also, and we could hear more about your side of it. But thanks so much for having me today, and thanks so much for the great work you're doing.